Living End is a powerful deck in the modern format of Magic the Gathering, and whether you're playing with or against this all-in combo deck, you'll want to know the different punches this deck can throw as it tries to reanimate its entire graveyard while simultaneously wiping the board. Wiping the board and also reanimating everything at once? That sounds game-winning, and you'd be right. This is an introduction to the deck Living End, and this is Open Decklists. The namesake card of this deck, Living End, is a sorcery that typically resolves around turn 7 if you cast it in a fair way, paying 2 a black and a black and then suspending it for 3 turns so that your opponent can see it coming is how this card was intended to be played. However, we're not going to be paying that cost and doing this on turn 7. Instead, we'll be doing it as early as turn 3. The way that we can cast such a powerful effect of wiping the board and reanimating all of the graveyard is through the use of our Cascade spells, such as Shardless Agent, as well as Violent Outburst. It turns out that we don't actually need to draw the card Living End at all. In fact, if we just cast one of these Cascade spells, the Cascade effect will find Living End for us, cast it for free without having to suspend it at all. But it does come at a cost, because after all, Cascade is going to cast the first spell it encounters that costs less than this one. So in this case, it would be a 1 or a 2 mana card. So the cost that we have to pay for this is actually a deck building cost, which is that we can't include any cards that cost 1 or 2 mana in this deck. This way, our Cascade spells will reliably hit Living End, allowing our deck to use that powerful effect consistently and in a timely manner. So you might be wondering, what exactly are we reanimating when we cast Living End? Well, the deck gets to play a pile of kind of awkward looking creatures because they all have a few things in common. They want to be in the graveyard and they reliably can get there. The deck plays a suite of various powerful cycling creatures, even though cards like this striped Riverwinder here may look like a bad draft card. It ends up being pretty good because when you're not paying 7 mana to cast it, it's just a 5/5 hexproof that maybe we can dump a few of them into play on turn 3. By cycling creatures like this striped Riverwinder or a Curator of Mysteries early in the game, it's going to fill our graveyard as well as churn through extra cards to be able to find a Cascade spell, making the deck even more consistent. So Living End is interested in filling its graveyard with cheap, powerful, or useful creatures, including ones like Architects of Will. Still just cycling at 1 mana, it is only a 3/3, but when it comes into play, being able to sort the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck can help confirm that they're not going to be drawing any good cards before they're hopefully dead. One of our favorite cycling cards is when we don't have to pay any mana for it for cards like Street Wraith, merely paying 2 life. This is one of your favorite cards to see in the deck since it is just a free redraw on the cycling effect and another creature to add to the pile in your graveyard to ultimately reanimate later. The deck also has a few larger creatures that it can put in its graveyard, although they do cost 2 mana to use, but Waker of Waves as a 7/7 that shrinks your opponent's team is a very, very nasty creature to reanimate, and by spending 2 mana and discarding it, it gives you card selection and potentially can dump another creature in your graveyard along the way. Adding some utility from this draft all-star, the Colossal Sky Turtle, allows us to have 2 different effects attached to a 6/5 flying Ward 2 body, which is really, really hard to deal with as early as turn 3. And the utility of being able to bounce a creature to its owner's hand, or at times even regrowth a card out of your graveyard, make this flying turtle a very, very nice, flexible spot in the deck. In a similar vein to the turtle, Brazen Borrower fills a similar role by adding utility. Although Petty Theft, the bounce effect here, does not send Brazen Borrower into our graveyard, it does hit other permanent types that could be problematic. After all, we do need to protect our graveyard, and sometimes that involves bouncing an enchantment or an artifact, which the turtle can't do. Similar to Street Wraith, Grief is one of the best cards that we want to see in our deck. As a 0 mana Thoughtseize effect, Grief is going to end up in our graveyard after it dies, which is perfect because that's where we want it to be when we reanimate it with Living End. It also gives us an outlet of something to do with a Living End in case we draw one of them. The last place we want Living End is in our hand. We prefer them all to be in our deck. But just in case we do draw one of them, or perhaps have an extra Architects of Will laying around, we can pitch them to Grief and clear the way of any counter spells, board wipes, or other problematic cards. This helps to keep our main game plan safe by having a 0 mana discard effect to lead the way. Another really powerful card in this deck is Force of Negation, because it fits the Cascade requirement of being 3 mana or more, but also helps insulate our deck and our combo from any problematic cards. One of the most powerful lines of play that you can have is casting Violent Outburst on your opponent's upkeep or end of turn, since it is an instant, allowing you to hold up Force of Negation at instant speed in case your opponent has any shenanigans for when you try to Living End. Since the cards we're throwing into our graveyard are often redrawing us more cards, we often can end up with an extra blue card to pitch away, such as perhaps a redundant Cascade spell like Shardless Agent, making Force of Negation a surprisingly easy spell to cast despite its card disadvantage. After all, card disadvantage doesn't really matter if your opponent's dead. The core of the deck is centered around blue as a color, and since we want to be cascading as early as turn 3, Botanical Sanctum and Spirebluff Canal are excellent lands in this deck. There are some flexible land spots depending on the current metagame, but Otawara is one of our best options since it is blue, and late in the game it can bounce a problematic spell that's an artifact, enchantment, or planeswalker that's stopping you from executing your combo, which is a lot of utility to get out of an untapped, on-color land. So what does the sideboard look like? Well, we have to stick to the deck building cost that everything has to cost 3 or more, but thankfully, there's plenty of good options out here. Endurance is a spell that costs 3 or can exile a green card and effectively costs 0. At times, your opponent is going to be actively filling their graveyard once they know what you're up to. That way they can get their creatures back whenever you Living End. Endurance is a great card to be able to tuck those cards back on the bottom of your opponent's deck and successfully cast Living End, leaving your opponent with an empty board and an empty life total. Mystical Dispute is a 1 mana card disguised as a 3 mana card, so our Cascade spells won't hit it, but it will still counter the problematic blue spells that we want it to, like Teferi Time Raveler. Since we're operating so heavily out of our graveyard, our opponents are almost assuredly bound to have graveyard hate, which often can come in the form of artifacts or enchantments. So Force of Vigor is a great option to be able to chuck an extra green card and destroy up to 2 artifacts or enchantments. Foundation Breaker is another way that we can deal with problematic artifacts or enchantments proactively, such as Leyline of the Void, Rest in Peace, or Chalice of the Void. This one comes on a creature as well, so we'll get a repeated effect after we evoke Foundation Breaker, like we do with Grief, and then it comes back when we Living End as well, in case your opponent has added another artifact or enchantment to the board. Leyline of Sanctity might look like a bit of an odd inclusion in the sideboard, but with being a deck that is so focused on its core game plan of cycling cards, it leaves us susceptible to decks like Burn that are going to point a lot of damage at our face. Leyline of Sanctity can slow them down by a few turns, and at times just win the game outright. It also has a few other hidden modes where it can stop cards like Endurance, since Endurance does target players after all. Speaking of Endurance is a really hard card for Living End to play around because it doesn't get hit by Force of Negation, it's hard to see coming because it can be cast for 0 mana, and they can do it right as we're most exposed, right before we cast Living End. But thankfully, Subtlety is an excellent card to deal with that. Not only being able to answer cards like Endurance, but other problematic cards like Teferi Time Raveler, and of course, because we're evoking it, it'll end up in our graveyard, and it'll come back when we Living End. Isn't this deck beautiful? It just has all these terrific cards that account for all the angles your opponent might try and attack your incredibly synergistic game plan. And that's why it's one of the top decks in the modern Magic the Gathering format today. So if you want to learn more about Living End, check out my leveling up videos about level 1, level 2, and level 3 tips for playing with or against this Living End deck. And thank you for watching.